In 1970, a British scholar named John Marco Allegro, a trained philologist who had spent 17 years translating the Dead Sea Scrolls, published a book that ended his career in a single week. The book was called The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. Its central claim, Jesus Christ never existed. The entire New Testament, Allegro argued, was an elaborate code, not for a hidden gospel, not for a political message, but for a psychoactive mushroom. The red-capped, white-spotted Amanita muscaria, the fly agaric, the mushroom you have seen in every fairy tale, every video game, every Christmas card your entire life. Within days of publication, 15 of Britain's top biblical scholars signed a joint letter calling his work fantasy. His own publisher issued a public apology for printing it. His mentor disowned him. His university position evaporated. He never held an academic post again. And he died on his 65th birthday, largely forgotten. That was 1970. But here is what nobody expected. 50 years later, the theory refused to die. Joe Rogan discussed it with millions of listeners. TikTok clips collected nearly 100,000 likes. A 2020 bestseller reopened the same questions. And a 1,200-year-old fresco in a tiny French chapel, showing what appears to be a giant mushroom standing between Adam and Eve, kept pulling people back to the same unsettling question Allegro asked half a century ago. Today we are tracing the full arc of the strangest theory in the history of biblical scholarship, from the caves of Qumran to a medieval chapel in rural France to the most popular podcast on Earth. And by the end, you will know exactly what the evidence says and what it does not. John Marco Allegro was not a crank. That is the detail that makes this story impossible to dismiss. He was born in 1923 in London, served in the Royal Navy, and after the war began training as a Methodist minister, but languages fascinated him more than sermons. He earned honors in Oriental Studies at Manchester, a master's degree, then studied Hebrew dialects at Oxford under one of Britain's most respected Semitic scholars, Professor Godfrey Driver. By 1953, he was invited to join the international team translating the Dead Sea Scrolls, ancient Jewish manuscripts discovered in caves near the Dead Sea, dating from the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century CE. One of the most important archaeological finds of the 20th century, and Allegro became part of the inner circle. One thing set him apart. He was the only agnostic on the team. Every other member was a committed Christian or observant Jew. Allegro had no religious loyalty to protect. That distinction would crack his entire career open. He was brilliant and productive. He arranged for the copper scroll to be physically cut open at Manchester so it could be read. He produced the first translation. He made BBC broadcasts presenting bold interpretations his colleagues found reckless. He published ahead of schedule. He accused fellow scholars of suppressing findings that might challenge Christian doctrine. By 1960, his relationships with the team were shattered. He was already a provocateur, already isolated, already convinced the establishment was hiding something, and it was in that isolation that he developed the theory that would bury him. The argument Allegro presented in The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross was not a single claim. It was an entire alternative history of Western civilization. Christianity, he argued, did not begin with a man from Nazareth. It began as a secret fertility cult in the ancient Near East, a cult whose central sacrament was the Amanita muscaria mushroom. The stories of Jesus, his virgin birth, his miracles, his crucifixion, his resurrection, were not historical events. They were cryptographic codes designed to hide the cult's real knowledge from Roman authorities who would have destroyed them. His method was linguistic. Allegro spoke Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, Latin, Syriac, Akkadian, and Sumerian. He believed Sumerian was the master key underlying both Semitic and Indo-European language families. He traced biblical names backward through chains of etymology, 4, 5, sometimes 6 steps of wordplay across languages, until he arrived at Sumerian roots connected to fertility, rain, and mushrooms. The name Christ, he argued, derived from Sumerian words meaning smeared with semen, a reference to the sticky cap of the mushroom after rain. The Apostle Peter derived from a word meaning mushroom through Sumerian to Greek transformations. The virgin birth was a metaphor for mushrooms appearing from the ground with no visible seed. The crucifixion and resurrection mirrored the mushroom's rapid life cycle, sprouting, withering, and sprouting again from hidden mycelium. The Last Supper was a coded mushroom ceremony. The Garden of Eden's tree of knowledge was the sacred fungus itself. And the kingdom of heaven was not a place. It was a psychedelic experience. The scale of the claim was breathtaking, and the reaction was instantaneous. Time magazine reported that scholars considered the book the psychedelic ravings of a hippie cultist. 15 British academics, including Allegro's own mentor, Godfrey Driver, signed a joint letter to the Times of London calling it an essay in fantasy rather than philology. The historian Philip Jenkins later called it possibly the single most ludicrous book on Jesus scholarship by a qualified academic. Allegro's publisher, Hodder and Stoughton, took the extraordinary step of publicly apologizing for releasing it. His obituary in the Daily Telegraph would eventually call him the Liberace of biblical scholarship. He resigned from Manchester and never returned to formal academia. But the story does not end with his humiliation. It splits into two parallel tracks, one in the world of art history, the other in popular culture, and both refuse to close. In a tiny chapel in the village of Mérigny in central France, there is a fresco painted on the wall sometime around 1291. The chapel was built by the Knights Hospitallers of St. John of Jerusalem. The fresco depicts Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Between them stands the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the tree looks remarkably like a giant Amanita muscaria mushroom, a branching cluster of red caps with a serpent coiled around the base. The image was first noted in 1909. By the 1950s, the amateur mycologist R. Gordon Wasson traveled to see the fresco himself. But Wasson consulted the eminent art historian Urban Panofsky, who told him the tree was simply a conventionalized artistic style common in Romanesque and early Gothic painting. It was called a Pilzbaum, literally mushroom tree, not because it depicted a mushroom, but because medieval artists routinely stylized trees in this bulbous, rounded form. Wasson accepted this and abandoned the connection. Allegro did not. He used the Plaincourault fresco as visual evidence in his 1970 book, and it has circulated on the internet ever since. Art historians are nearly unanimous. Alina Gertzman has stated that virtually no specialist in medieval art subscribes to the psychedelic Christianity interpretation. Hundreds of similar stylized trees exist in Romanesque art across Europe. Medieval painters also drew lions that appear to be wearing spectacles and elephants with mitten-shaped feet. Stylization was the rule, not the exception, but the image is powerful precisely because it does not require expertise to interpret. A person looks at it and sees a mushroom, and that visceral reaction has kept the theory circulating for over a century. Let that settle for a moment. A fresco painted 700 years ago in a French chapel by anonymous monks continues to generate more debate than the entire corpus of Allegro's linguistic analysis. The image has outlived the argument. Then there is the question of manna. The Book of Exodus describes a substance that appeared on the ground overnight, looked like white frost, tasted of honey, and had to be collected at dawn before it rotted. Mushrooms do appear overnight after rain. They decompose rapidly. They attract insects. Terence McKenna suggested manna could have been Psilocybe cubensis, but the biblical description says manna could be ground and baked into bread, which no mushroom can. The scientific consensus remains that manna's identity is unknown, with leading candidates including tamarisk tree secretions, lichen, and honeydew from scale insects. So, why does this theory keep coming back? Why, in 2025, are more people aware of Allegro's argument than at any point since 1970? The answer is not a conspiracy. It is something more ordinary and honestly more fascinating: the collision between institutional credibility collapse and the psychedelic renaissance. When Joe Rogan discussed the sacred mushroom and the cross on his podcast, reaching tens of millions, he made several claims that do not hold up. He stated the Catholic Church bought out copies to suppress it, There is no documentary evidence this happened. The book's temporary scarcity is fully explained by the publisher's withdrawal and Allegro's disgrace. It was translated into several languages during the 1970s. A 40th anniversary edition was published in 2009. It remains in print today. Nobody suppressed it. The Academy simply stopped taking it seriously, which, to many people in the age of institutional distrust, feels like the same thing. And that is the engine driving the revival. In a cultural moment where credibility has suffered, the idea that a brilliant scholar was silenced for speaking truth carries enormous emotional gravity. The pattern is seductive: a lone genius, a forbidden book, a powerful institution afraid of the truth. It maps perfectly onto every suppressed knowledge narrative that thrives on social media. The problem is that the evidence does not support the suppression story. Allegro was not silenced. He was refuted, loudly, publicly, and by people with no motive to protect Christianity. His own agnostic mentor rejected it. Secular linguists rejected it. The etymological chains he constructed are the kind of method that can be made to prove virtually anything, which means it proves nothing. But here is what makes this more than a simple debunking story. The underlying questions Allegro raised, even if he answered them badly, are real questions that modern science is now taking seriously. The 2006 Psilocybin study at Johns Hopkins University found that a single dose produced experiences that 1/3 of participants rated as the most spiritually significant of their entire lives. Clinical trials have demonstrated lasting personality changes, relief from treatment-resistant depression, and reduced anxiety in terminal patients. Psychoactive substances can generate experiences that are subjectively indistinguishable from religious revelation. That is no longer fringe speculation. It is published clinical data. The question of whether altered states of consciousness played a role in the origins of human religion is a legitimate scientific question. Allegro was asking that question in 1970, decades ahead of the research tools that might have helped him answer it responsibly. What he lacked was evidence, method, and restraint. What he had was audacity, linguistic talent, and a career-ending willingness to say what he believed. And there is one final twist that most people who encounter this theory on social media never learn. A 2025 academic paper revealed that Allegro did not believe psychedelics offered genuine spiritual insight. He believed they caused madness and delusion. His purpose in writing the book was not to celebrate the mushroom. It was to demolish Christianity by reducing it to drug-induced fertility orgies in desert caves. He was not a psychedelic prophet. He was a debunker who accidentally became the patron saint of a movement he would have despised. The scholarly consensus is clear. The etymological method is unsound. There is no archaeological evidence of Amanita muscaria use in the ancient Near East. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain nothing about mushrooms. The code he claimed to have cracked is unfalsifiable, which places it outside the boundaries of testable scholarship. The medieval art he cited is explained by well-documented artistic conventions. The Amanita muscaria itself is not even a reliable visionary mushroom. The theory does not hold up, but the questions behind it are not going away. Did psychoactive substances influence religious thought in human history? Almost certainly, in some cultures, at some times. Is Amanita muscaria the key to Christianity? The evidence says no. Could spiritual experience be partly rooted in neurochemistry? Modern research increasingly suggests yes. Allegro reached the right neighborhood and knocked on the wrong door. Roman scholars debated divine experience 2,000 years ago. Siberian shamans consumed Amanita muscaria for centuries. The Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece may have involved ergot-derived psychoactive compounds. Every culture in human history has sought altered states through plants, fungi, fasting, chanting, or isolation. The search for transcendence is the oldest human project there is. Allegro's tragedy was not that he asked the question. It was that he answered it with certainty where the evidence demanded humility. The truth is not a doctrine, it is a direction, and the willingness to follow it, even when it leads somewhere uncomfortable, is the only thing that separates scholarship from faith.